Picture this. Your history teacher stands in front of the class and says, "Sexuality has always been the same. Heterosexual relationships were the norm. Everything else was deviant, hidden, or punished." And your textbook agrees. Every civilization, every century, one default setting. Here's the problem. That's not history. That's editing. Because when you actually read the sources, not the summaries, not the textbook versions, the actual court records, the legal codes, the poetry, the temple inscriptions, you find something completely different. You find civilizations that built legal structures around gender diversity, religious systems that required it, military units that depended on it, artistic traditions that celebrated it without apology. Today, we're going through 8 of them, not as a list of exceptions, not as footnotes, as the actual historical record of how human societies understood sexuality and gender before someone decided there was only one correct answer. We'll cover ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, Mesopotamia, pre-colonial Americas, Mughal India, ancient Japan, and Polynesia. And then we'll talk about why most people have never heard any of this, because that part is just as important as the history itself. Let's start. Ancient Greece, where the categories don't work. Everyone points to ancient Greece first, and they're right to, but almost everyone gets the details wrong in ways that matter. The Greeks did not have the words gay, straight, or bisexual. They didn't need them. They had a completely different framework for understanding desire, and forcing our modern categories onto it misses the entire point. In classical Athens, the most documented and socially celebrated form of male love was between an older man, the Erastes, and a younger one, the Eromenos. This relationship was not hidden or shameful. It was considered by certain philosophical circles to be the highest form of human connection. Socrates argued it was more noble than heterosexual love because it was driven by the soul rather than the body. Plato built an entire philosophical framework, what we now call Platonic love, partly from his observations of these relationships. The Spartans went further. Their warrior culture didn't just accept male love, it institutionalized it. Soldiers were expected to fight beside the men they loved because shame in front of your beloved was considered stronger motivation than fear of death. The Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite military unit of 150 paired male lovers, was considered the most formidable fighting force in Greece. It was undefeated for 33 years. Philip of Macedon destroyed it at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE and reportedly wept when he saw the bodies, all 300 of them fallen together, none having run. Now here's where it gets complicated. This acceptance came wrapped in very specific conditions about age, social status, and role. The framework was about social hierarchy, not identity. Modern historians debate whether we can meaningfully call these men gay in any sense we'd recognize, or whether we're just projecting our own categories onto a society that thought about sexuality in an entirely different language. That debate is not settled. It probably never will be. But what is not debatable is that same-sex relationships were publicly celebrated, philosophically elevated, and militarily institutionalized in one of the civilizations that forms the foundation of Western culture. And what about women? Sappho of Lesbos, yes, that is literally where the word lesbian comes from, wrote poetry about love between women with an urgency and precision that reads as completely contemporary. She ran a school for young women on the island of Lesbos where emotional and physical bonds were part of the educational model. The poet Antipater called her the 10th muse. What survives of her work, and most of it was destroyed, shows a woman who treated love between women as worthy of the highest poetic form available. Rome, the empire that made it administrative. If Greece philosophized about it, Rome bureaucratized it. The Roman Empire was enormous, sexually chaotic by almost any standard, and genuinely unconcerned with the gender of your partner as a moral question. What concerned Romans was social hierarchy, specifically who was doing what to whom in the penetrative dynamic, and whether that arrangement respected the status of a free Roman citizen. Emperor Hadrian's relationship with the young Greek Antinous is one of the most extensively documented same-sex relationships in all of antiquity. When Antinous died, drowned in the Nile under circumstances that were never fully explained, Hadrian's grief was so extreme it disrupted the functioning of the empire. He deified Antinous, built a city named Antinoupolis in his honor, commissioned statues that were distributed across the empire, established a religious cult that lasted for over 200 years. Coins were minted with Antinous's face. This was not hidden. This was state-level commemoration of an emperor's love for a man. But here's what makes Rome genuinely different from our modern understanding. The Romans did not have a concept of sexual orientation. What they had was a concept of sexual role. A free adult male Roman citizen could desire anyone, women, men, enslaved people, without that desire categorizing him. What mattered was that he occupied the active, penetrating role. Being penetrated, if you were a free citizen, implied a passive, social role considered incompatible with Roman masculinity. This is why the story of Emperor Nero marrying his male companion Sporus and taking the receptive role in the relationship was considered scandalous, not because it was a same-sex relationship, but because it implied the Emperor of Rome was occupying a subordinate social position. The ancient sources present this as evidence of Nero's general degeneracy, not as proof of homosexuality in any sense we'd recognize. Roman women also had documented same-sex relationships. The poet Sulpicia wrote love poetry to other women. Various legal texts mention women who preferred women. Emperor Augustus's niece was reportedly in a lesbian relationship and was criticized for it, which tells us that female same-sex relationships existed, were known, and carried a different social weight than male ones. What Rome shows us is a civilization where same-sex behavior was completely unremarkable across vast portions of society. Not because Romans were uniquely tolerant, but because they organized sexuality around hierarchy and role rather than around the gender of your partner. Egypt, the oldest documented same-sex couple in history. Ancient Egypt gives us something remarkable. The oldest archaeologically documented same-sex couple in recorded history. The tomb of Khnum-Hotep and Neon-Khnum, servants in the royal palace during the 5th dynasty around 2400 BCE, shows them in poses that are unambiguous in Egyptian artistic convention. They are depicted embracing, their noses touching. In Egyptian iconography, nose touching was the gesture of intimate connection, the equivalent of a kiss. Their tomb identifies them as joint officials and describes them as beloved of their king. They were buried together, which in ancient Egypt was an honor reserved for people of significant social standing. Their relationship was not hidden. Their tomb was not tucked away. It was located in a prominent position at Saqqara. They were important people, publicly commemorated together, in a culture that did not think this required justification or explanation. Later Egyptian sources reinforce this picture. Various Middle Kingdom texts reference male same-sex relationships without negative judgment. The Westcar Papyrus contains a story involving a pharaoh and a male companion in a context that suggests these relationships were simply part of the landscape of Egyptian court life. What's honest to say is that we don't fully understand why ancient Egypt appears to have been accepting of these relationships. Some scholars connect it to Egyptian religious concepts about duality and the complementarity of opposites. Others suggest the culture simply didn't organize morality around sexuality in the way later civilizations did. The evidence is clear. The interpretation is still being worked out. Mesopotamia, where the third gender was holy. Here's where the history gets genuinely extraordinary. Because Mesopotamia didn't just tolerate gender diversity, it built it into its religious architecture. The Sumerian language had a word, ur-sal, for what we might call a third gender. By the Akkadian period, the category had become central to the worship of Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and beauty, later known as Ishtar. The priests of Inanna's temple, called the Gala, adopted feminine appearance, performed feminine religious rituals, and occupied a recognized spiritual role that derived its power precisely from existing outside the male-female binary. This is not marginal. This is not a footnote. The Gala priests were essential to Inanna's worship. They performed the sacred lamentations, a specific form of religious music and poetry considered to have direct power over the divine. Their gender nonconformity was not incidental to their spiritual role, it was the source of their spiritual authority. One documented Gala priest named Ur-Nama later became king of Ur, one of the most powerful rulers in Mesopotamian history. His gender nonconforming religious role did not prevent him from achieving the highest political office in the land. Assyrian legal records also mention a category called the Senishu, individuals who lived as women regardless of the sex they were assigned at birth. The evidence is complex. Some Assyrian laws prescribed punishments for this, while other evidence suggests these individuals were integrated into social and religious life. The picture is contradictory, as real history usually is. What Mesopotamia shows us is a civilization that understood gender as something that could be transcended for sacred purposes. The Gala priests were not considered degraded, they were considered holy. That concept, the sacred status of gender diversity, appears in culture after culture around the world, which is worth remembering when people claim that binary gender is the eternal human default. Pre-colonial Americas, the deliberate destruction. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had some of the most extensive and best documented traditions of gender diversity in the world, and almost all of it was deliberately destroyed. The modern umbrella term Two-Spirit was created in 1990 by indigenous scholars to describe the many gender-diverse roles that existed across hundreds of distinct nations before European contact. The term is useful but inadequate. It covers an enormous diversity of specific practices, roles, and spiritual frameworks that vary dramatically between cultures and should never be collapsed into a single description. Among the Navajo, the Nadlahi combined male and female spiritual elements and held important ceremonial roles. They were not seen as deficient or cursed, they were seen as blessed, capable of moving between worlds in ways that neither men nor women could. Among the Lakota, the Winkta occupied a recognized social and spiritual category. Among the Mojave, there were separate categories for female-assigned and male-assigned individuals who lived as the opposite gender, with their own specific social roles and ritual functions. The most famous specific example is Wewa of the Zuni people, an individual who lived as a man but performed roles considered women's work and who was a highly respected artist, weaver, and spiritual leader. Wewa met with President Grover Cleveland in 1886 as a diplomatic representative of the Zuni nation. The president had no idea he was meeting someone his own culture would have categorized as gender non-conforming. The pattern across these nations was not tolerance or grudging acceptance. It was integration and celebration. Two-Spirit people were healers, mediators, artists, and spiritual leaders. They were not marginal to their societies, they were essential to them. And then the missionaries arrived. Boarding schools, government policies, forced conversion, children taken from families and punished for any expression of gender nonconformity. The destruction was systematic, deliberate, and thorough. The trauma it caused is still present in indigenous communities today. The modern Two-Spirit movement is simultaneously a recovery of history and a healing from its violent suppression. Mughal India, the empire that made it poetry. The Mughal Empire is an uncomfortable case study for anyone who wants a simple narrative. Because here was an Islamic empire, and we're about to describe centuries of celebrated male same-sex love at its highest levels. History is complicated. The Mughals are proof. The Mughal courts were centers of artistic production at a scale that's difficult to comprehend. Persian and Urdu poetry were the highest art forms, and male same-sex love was a completely acceptable, often celebrated subject for the finest poets at the finest courts. This was not underground. This was the official culture of the empire. Emperor Akbar, who ruled from 1556 to 1605 and is considered one of the greatest rulers in Indian history, was surrounded by male favorites. His court poet, Faizi, wrote verses celebrating the emperor's male beloved that were performed at court in front of everyone as part of the highest cultural life of the empire. Akbar's son, Jahangir, documented his own attraction to men in his autobiography, the Jahangir Nama, with the same matter-of-fact tone a modern person might use in a personal journal. He kept beautiful young men at court and described his responses to their beauty in loving detail. Shah Jahan, the builder of the Taj Mahal, also had documented male lovers. The court poetry of his era celebrated same-sex love as equal to or greater than heterosexual love in its capacity to express the soul's desire for beauty. The Persian and Urdu literary traditions that flourished under the Mughals contain thousands of examples of this. The framework was explicitly spiritual. Desire, whether for a woman or a man, was understood as the soul's recognition of divine beauty. This made same-sex love not just acceptable, but philosophically elevated. Now here's where the complication is honest. Islamic law, which the Mughals nominally followed, did have restrictions on same-sex acts, and some Mughal rulers did enforce these at various points. The history is not uniformly accepting. But the courtly culture of celebration was strong enough to persist for generations and produce some of the most beautiful love poetry in any language. Japan, when the West arrived and broke it. Japan developed its own frameworks for understanding gender and sexuality that were entirely distinct from both Western and other Asian traditions, and then had those frameworks criminalized by the Japanese government in 1872, specifically to appear civilized to Western powers. Let that sit for a moment. Japan didn't criminalize same-sex relationships because of internal religious or moral pressure. It criminalized them as a diplomatic performance for Western observers. The traditional Japanese concept of nanshoku, male love, was documented, celebrated in art and literature, and unremarkable for centuries. Buddhist temples were known for relationships between monks and their apprentices. The samurai tradition had its own framework for male love between warriors and younger retainers, the wakashu, that was considered part of the proper formation of a warrior's character. The wakashu occupied a recognized social category between adult men and women. They were the object of desire for adult men. This was the dominant form of male love in Japanese society for centuries, and it had its own aesthetics, literature, poetry, and social norms. This was not hidden. There were entire literary and artistic genres devoted to it. The onagata, men who performed as women in theater, had a role that extended far beyond the stage. They were considered experts in feminine beauty and grace, and were sought out by aristocratic men as companions. Their gender performance was a social role with its own recognized position in the culture. Buddhism and Shinto, Japan's dominant religious traditions, did not consider male love to be sinful or problematic. There was no theological framework of condemnation. The acceptance was genuine, long-standing, and culturally embedded. And then, in 1872, the Meiji government, in the middle of a program of rapid westernization, criminalized same-sex acts. Not because Japanese society demanded it, because Western diplomats expected it. This is the moment that most histories skip over. The suppression of Japan's indigenous traditions around same-sex love was not the restoration of some ancient morality. It was the adoption of a foreign one, under political pressure for diplomatic reasons. Polynesia, the paradise that was destroyed. Polynesian cultures had some of the most visible and well-documented gender-diverse traditions in the world. and Christian missionaries systematically destroyed them within a few generations. In Hawaii, the Mahu were individuals who lived as a third gender, recognized, accepted, and given important roles in religion, healing, and craft traditions. Hawaiian culture understood gender as a spectrum. The Mahu were not deviations from the norm. They were part of how Hawaiian society understood human diversity. King Kamehameha III had a Mahu advisor. The role was considered socially essential. In Tahiti, the Mahu served similar functions. Captain James Cook documented their presence and acceptance in the 18th century, as did other European explorers who arrived in the Pacific during the same period. Samoa had the Fa'afine, individuals assigned male at birth who lived as women and held recognized roles in the culture. Tonga had the Whakalady. What's important to understand is that these weren't marginal curiosities that tolerant cultures happen to include. They were integrated social roles with spiritual significance, community functions, and cultural respect. And then the missionaries arrived. The word Mahu became a slur. The religious and social roles that gender-diverse people had held were dismantled. In Hawaii, the transformation was so complete that contemporary Hawaiian LGBTQ+ activists have had to reconstruct their connections to these traditions almost entirely from historical documents written by the same Europeans who helped destroy them. The pattern across Polynesia was consistent. Christianity arrived, declared these traditions sinful, colonial governments provided the legal enforcement, and within a generation or two, what had been a recognized and respected social role became invisible. The eraser. Who did this and why? We can't tell this history without telling the story of its destruction, because the pattern is too consistent to be accidental. In the Americas, boarding schools, forced conversion, legal prohibition of indigenous practices. In Africa, colonial governments imported and enforced laws against same-sex relationships that remain in place in dozens of countries today. In India, the British imposed Section 377, a law against carnal intercourse against the order of nature that remained in effect until 2018. In Japan, same-sex acts criminalized to satisfy Western diplomatic expectations. In Polynesia, missionaries and colonial governments dismantled traditions that had existed for centuries. The mechanism was the same everywhere. Christian missionaries arrived with a specific theological position on sexuality. Colonial governments had the power to enforce it. Indigenous traditions were reframed as primitive, sinful, or deviant. Laws were written, punishments were imposed, children were separated from the knowledge of their own cultures. And then, historians wrote the history of these civilizations without mentioning any of this. Students learned about ancient Greece without learning about Two-Spirit people. They learned about Rome without learning about the Mughal courts. They learned about Western civilization as if it had always organized sexuality the way it does now. It hadn't, and the civilizations it colonized hadn't either. What this means. Here's what the actual historical record shows across 8 civilizations, multiple continents, and thousands of years of documented human history. Human diversity existed. It has always existed. And the societies that encountered it made choices about how to respond. Some built legal structures around it. Some built religious structures around it. Some built military structures around it. Some built artistic traditions around it that produced some of the most beautiful poetry and philosophy in human history. The idea that heterosexuality and binary gender are the historical default, that everything else is modern, invented, or Western, is not history. It is a story that was told for specific political purposes by specific people at a specific moment in time. And it was told by erasing the records of everyone who came before them. Those records are still there, in the tomb at Saqqara, in the Mughal court poetry, in the dynastic histories of Han China, in the oral traditions that survive the boarding schools, in the graffiti and the legal codes and the religious texts of civilizations that didn't think any of this needed justification because it was simply part of what human beings were. The eraser came later. The history came first. The erased. History they didn't teach you.